The Bank of England rejoined the QE club this month by announcing that it will print another £70 billion between now and March 2017. In this third round of BOE QE, the UK Central Bank will use £60 billion of this new money to buy UK government bonds, effectively cancelling a further £60 billion of UK government debt. That will increase the amount of UK government debt effectively cancelled by the Bank of England from £375 billion to £435 billion, or approximately 28% of all UK government debt. Together, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan are now printing the equivalent of $500 billion every 3 months, and using that new money to effectively cancel nearly $500 billion of government debt per quarter. In total, those 3 central banks, plus the Fed, have effectively canceled roughly $8 trillion of government debt that way thus far. In this video, we're going to look at the scale of quantitative easing now occurring around the world. We'll quickly review how quantitative easing effectively cancels government debt. We'll see how much UK, US, European, and Japanese government debt has been canceled by the central banks so far. And we'll see how the collapse in interest rates that quantitative easing has brought about is setting the stage for a massive, globally coordinated fiscal stimulus program. Very large-scale fiscal stimulus will be the next phase of the government policy response to the global economic crisis. On August 4th, the Bank of England announced it's launching its third round of quantitative easing. The BOE will print £70 billion between now and March 2017, and it will use that money to buy £60 billion of UK government bonds and £10 billion of UK corporate bonds. The Bank of England press conference was very informative. You should watch it. Here's the link. This news had a big impact on global financial markets. The yield on the 10-year UK government bond fell from 0.8% in early August to 0.5% on August 12th. And it had been 2.1% as recently as November 2015. The yield on Spanish and Irish government bonds fell to new record lows, and the yield on US and Italian government bonds fell very close to new record lows. Corporate bond yields also fell. Falling yields pushed up equity prices around the world. The Dow, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ all hit new record highs. That's the first time that's happened during the same week since 1999. Emerging market equities also benefited. Okay, so the Bank of Japan and the ECB are also now carrying out quantitative easing on a very large scale. Here are the details. The Bank of England is printing £70 billion over 8 months. So that's £9 billion a month, or $11 billion a month, which amounts to $34 billion per quarter. The Bank of Japan is printing 80 trillion yen per year. That's 6.7 trillion yen per month, $67 billion per month, or $200 billion per quarter. The ECB is printing 80 billion euros per month. That's $90 billion per month, or $270 billion per quarter. So these 3 central banks are printing almost $170 billion a month, which is roughly $500 billion per quarter. Now, in February last year, I made a Macro Watch video called QE is Debt Cancellation. It explained how quantitative easing effectively cancels government debt. Anyone can watch this video for free. Here's the link. If you don't understand what I mean by QE as debt cancellation, then you should watch that video again. Here, I'll only provide a short explanation in the next 3 charts. When a central bank buys the government's debt, it's the same thing as canceling the debt, so long as the central bank never sells those bonds, and so long as it rolls the bonds over when they mature, as all the central banks do now. The government pays interest on its bonds to the central bank, and then the central bank returns to the government the profits it earns from that interest income. That means the bonds have been, in effect, canceled. So technically, then, perhaps we should say QE is debt suspension rather than cancellation. But I believe this suspended debt can be, should be, and will be actually canceled. But regardless of whether it remains permanently suspended or actually canceled, this reality of trillions of dollars of debt with no cost has enormous implications. Governments have much less debt than is generally understood, and that means they could spend more and finally end this global economic crisis. Okay, here's how it works, using the US as an example. The Fed creates money and buys US government bonds. The US Treasury Department pays interest on those bonds to the Fed. The Fed then turns around and gives almost all the interest income it earns on the government bonds back to the Treasury. The Fed keeps a small fraction of the interest income to cover its expenses, but the Fed gives all its profits to the Treasury every year. That means the Treasury is not really paying interest on those bonds. In other words, the government bonds owned by the Fed have been effectively canceled. $8.2 trillion of government debt has been effectively canceled thus far. Here are the details. The Bank of England has acquired 375 billion pounds of UK government debt. That's equivalent to $488 billion. The Bank of Japan has acquired 368 trillion yen worth of Japanese government debt. That's roughly $3.7 trillion. The ECB has acquired $1.3 trillion of euro area government debt. That's approximately $1.5 trillion. And the Fed has acquired almost $2.5 trillion worth of US government debt. So adding those 4 together, what we see is that $8.15 trillion of government debt has been acquired by the central banks and thus effectively canceled. And note that this total is scheduled to increase by $1 trillion over the next 6 months, since 3 of these 4 central banks will print $500 billion every 3 months. Okay, so let's look at the 4 central banks that have conducted quantitative easing, one at a time, starting with the Bank of Japan. Okay, in this chart, it shows the Bank of Japan holdings of central government debt. 368 trillion yen has been acquired by the Bank of Japan. And you can see this really started accelerating in 2013 and 2014. Now in this chart, we have total Japanese government debt in red and the amount of government debt that has been acquired by the Bank of Japan in green. So total debt and the amount of debt that has been effectively canceled by the Bank of Japan. And this shows the percent. That's roughly 35% of all Japanese government debt has now been acquired by the Bank of Japan. This is the Bank of Japan's holdings of government debt as a percent of total Japanese government debt, 35%. And this ratio is increasing very rapidly. So Japanese government net borrowing is estimated to be 25 trillion yen this year, according to the IMF. That's roughly the amount of the budget deficit. So the Bank of Japan is printing $80 trillion yen a year, enough to finance all the government's net borrowing more than 3 times over. In other words, the central bank is buying much more government debt each year than the government is issuing to finance its budget deficit. That means total Japanese government debt is shrinking with every month that passes, at least the amount of government debt not owned by the Bank of Japan. In fact, if the Bank of Japan continues printing 80 trillion yen a year, it could effectively cancel all currently existing Japanese government debt within the next 9 years. Next, the European Central Bank. It has acquired 1.3 trillion euros worth of euro area government debt. And you can see this really accelerated from the end of 2014. In this chart in red, we see the total euro area 18, the debt of the 18 countries that make up the euro area. That's shown in red. And in green, we see the amount of that debt that has been acquired by the European Central Bank. The green, the data goes out to August. The debt data only goes out to the first quarter. That's where there's a gap in between. You can see this ratio has been increasing very quickly, and the ECB now effectively owns 12%. It does own 12% of all euro area government debt. And the ratio is increasing very rapidly and will continue to. So the ECB is printing 80 billion euros per month and using that money to buy bonds. That amounts to 960 billion euros per year. Roughly 85% of all the bonds being acquired by the ECB are government bonds, or roughly 816 billion euros of government bonds per year. Last year, the budget deficit of the euro area 19 countries was 216 billion euros. So the ECB is not only financing the budget deficit of these countries, it's financing it nearly 4 times over. It's funding the $216 billion a year budget deficit plus another 600 billion euros more. If the ECB continues acquiring government bonds at this rate, it could have effectively canceled all currently existing euro area government debt within about 8 years. Now the Bank of England. Round 1, QE round 1, round 2, and now QE 3 is beginning. The Bank of England has acquired £375 billion of UK government debt. Here you see the total UK government debt in red and the amount of UK government debt that has been acquired and effectively canceled by the Bank of England. This is projected out to 2017, but currently the Bank of England owns and has effectively canceled roughly 25% of all UK government debt, but this will be increasing. The UK government's net borrowing for this fiscal year is projected to be £56 billion, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility. That means that the Bank of England's purchases of £60 billion of government bonds between now and March will finance all the government's borrowing for the full fiscal year. In other words, the entire budget deficit this year will be fully monetized by the Bank of England between now and March. If the Bank of England were to continue acquiring UK government bonds at the current rate of £7.5 billion per month, it could have effectively canceled all currently existing UK government debt in about 12.5 years. Now finally, the Fed. The Fed has acquired $2.5 trillion of US government debt, plus another $1.75 trillion of mortgage-backed securities owned or guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So here in red you see total US government debt about $19 trillion, and in green the $2.5 trillion that has been acquired and effectively canceled by the Fed. That means the Fed owns and has effectively canceled about 13% of US government debt. Okay, so here we summarize the amount of government debt effectively canceled so far. The Bank of England owns and has effectively canceled 25% of UK government debt. The Bank of Japan owns and has effectively canceled 35% of Japanese government debt. The ECB owns and has effectively canceled 12% of euro area government debt. And the Fed owns and has effectively canceled 13% of US government debt. In the past, so much fiat money creation would have caused hyperinflation. But we don't live in the past. We now have a global economy with 7 billion people, 2 billion of whom live on less than $3 per day. That means we won't hit full labor capacity or have wage inflation for many decades. We also have excess industrial capacity across almost every industry globally, which also puts downward pressure on the price of industrial goods. That's why we can print money without causing inflation, as we've seen over the last 8 years. In fact, that's why we will have deflation if we don't print money. All right, this chart shows world inflation, world consumer price index, going back to 1969. The most recent month was only 2.3%. This is very low. In fact, it is the lowest we have seen since 1969, with the exception of the immediate aftermath of the 2008 crisis. The combination of very low inflation, or even deflation, with quantitative easing has pushed government borrowing cost to record low levels. The yield on the 10-year Japanese government bond is negative, minus 9 basis points. The yield on the European Union government bond, 10-year government bond yield, minus 9 basis points. That means those two governments can borrow money for free. In England, the 10-year bond yield is 57 basis points. It's come down very sharply since the end of last year, when it was above 2%. And in the US, the 10-year government bond yield is 1.5%, near an all-time record low. Monetary policy alone has been supporting the global economy since about 2010, when the initial post-crisis injection of fiscal stimulus ran out. Monetary policy has prevented a new Great Depression, but is now nearing the limits of its effectiveness, since interest rates are so close to or even below 0%. For the details on the limits to monetary policy, see Macro Watch First Quarter 2016, Are Central Banks Out of Ammunition? Since 2010, fiscal policy has been far too tight, and fiscal austerity has done a great deal of unnecessary harm. In the UK, austerity was a major reason the public voted for Brexit. Austerity has been abandoned by the new government in the UK. In Europe, Germany's insistence on austerity is a threat to the survival of the Eurozone. Germany is going to have to choose between austerity and the euro. I'm quite certain it's going to choose the euro. In the US, austerity is the reason Trump was able to take over the Republican Party, and it nearly allowed Sanders to take over the Democrat Party. Both parties will have to abandon austerity to survive. But austerity is about to end. Here are some encouraging facts. The first, a quote from the New Yorker. If you're despairing at this year's presidential election, here's something encouraging to focus on. Both candidates are proposing to increase infrastructure spending. Hillary Clinton has published a 5-year plan that would cost $275 billion. Donald Trump has also come out in favor of infrastructure investments. Earlier this month, he was asked about Clinton's proposals and how much he would spend. He said, "I would say at least double her numbers, and you're going to really need more than that." And here's a quote from the Financial Times last month. "At current interest rates, government borrowing to invest in high-quality projects is not just an opportunity, but an obligation." The collapse in global interest rates is paving the way for fiscal stimulus on a large scale. Governments will find such low borrowing cost irresistible, particularly in a political environment in which their very survival is at stake. It would be simply idiotic for the governments not to borrow at such low interest rates, particularly since the central banks have already effectively canceled so much government debt and are likely to cancel a great deal more. The benefits of fiscal stimulus would include more economic growth and more better-paying jobs, less income inequality, greatly improved infrastructure. Increased government borrowing would push interest rates higher. That would benefit savers. How much higher would depend on how much of the new spending is financed with additional quantitative easing. More global economic growth would reduce geopolitical tensions. And if governments invest the money in new industries and new technologies, we could grow our way out of this crisis while bringing about medical and technological breakthroughs, such as a cure for cancer and non-polluting, limitless energy. The Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Fed have already effectively canceled more than $8 trillion worth of government debt. 3 of those 4 are currently effectively canceling an additional $500 billion worth of government debt every quarter. Interest rates on government bonds have fallen close to or below 0% as a result. Ultra-low borrowing costs set the stage for the next phase of the government policy response to the global economic crisis. Expect a large-scale, globally coordinated fiscal stimulus program to be announced in early 2017. If a fiscal stimulus program is carried out aggressively enough, it will put an end to the economic crisis that began in 2008. Everyone needs to urge our elected representatives to vote for fiscal stimulus as soon as possible. The alternative could be economic collapse.